Brittany. Today I'm going to be creating a card using some La La Land Crafts products using the January 2019 kit as well as the Just For You background stamp. Starting off with 3 pieces of Nina Solar White here, and I'm going to create my panels for my background first. So I'm going to squeeze a little bit of Tombow Mono Multi Glue to the back of my panel here, smear that around with my finger. This is repositionable once it's dry, and I didn't want my card panel to move around in my MISTI when I'm stamping with my background stamp. So I'm going to be using Twirling Tutu ink by Simon Says Stamp, and I had a feeling I was probably going to have to stamp this twice, which I did, which is the reason for the glue on the back of my card panel. Now this does even out as it sits, as it dries. It is dry to the touch immediately, but as it dries even more, the colors kind of even out. So just keep that in mind when you stamp with this particular kind of dye ink. Went ahead and put that panel aside, and for my other panel I'm going to take another piece of the Nina Solar White, a piece of scrap paper, and I'm going to be using Fog ink, also by Simon Says Stamp, and I'm going to very lightly swipe the fog ink across my card panel, and I'm moving vertically. You don't necessarily have to move vertically, you just want to make sure that you go in the same direction each and every time, and I'm barely touching the ink pad to the paper. I wanted to add a little bit of pink to this, so I did take that Twirling Tutu just to add a little bit of that as well in the background, again going in the same direction. Went ahead and put both of those panels aside, and we'll work on our image itself. So the way the card kit comes, these are red rubber stamps, and they are all together. So you'll want to make sure that you're using super sharp scissors. I'm using the Tim Holtz shears here, and I'm just cutting away the sentiments that are attached to this particular stamp. I'm going to fussy cut my image out so it really doesn't really make a difference, but I knew I wanted to use one of these sentiments later on. So bringing back out my MISTI, I'm peeling off that backing there of my stamp, positioning that onto my panel there, and I'm going to be stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3, and I did stamp her twice just to make sure that I had a bold black outline for her. We'll move on to the Copic coloring, and I'm going to, like always, start off with her skin tones first. And if you've watched any of my videos, this isn't anything different. Starting off with the lightest color to map out where my shadows will be, which will be underneath her hair, underneath her chin, on the bottom part of her hands, underneath her skirt, and the inside of her legs. Also creating a 2 curvy lines for where her nose is and a little dash line where her kneecap would be. Going in with the darkest color, then the 2 midtones, then finally back to the lightest color, R20 for the cheeks, and then blending that back out with the lightest color. So this card is part of an Instagram hop that I am doing with a few of my friends on Instagram for Galentines Day instead of Valentine's Day, just to show love to your female friends or your crafty friends. So I will go ahead and link my Instagram below in the description if you want to head on over to Instagram, check out not just my Instagram, but the other ladies that are involved in the hop. I believe there is a total of 11 of us, and there is also giveaways. And the hop starts today. And this is February 12th, and it will end on February 16th. So this coming Saturday is when the giveaways will be closed and the names will be drawn. There are 3 gift cards that we're going to be giving away, so you may want to check that out as well as the other Instagram accounts. So here I am just finishing up her skin tones here, adding that color to her cheeks, and I usually flick from the outside of her face towards the center for the cheek color there and just blend that out with my lightest color again, just to kind of even everything out. Next, we'll move on to her hair, and I'm going to be coloring this a lot different than I normally do with hair. I usually use a lot of flicking motions for hair because I feel like it gives it a realistic look, but for this particular image, that wasn't necessary the way it's drawn. So I'm going to do something super easy, and it's a great way to get some practice with coloring. So I'm going to start with my E53, and I'm covering up everything. I'm covering up all of the different strands of her hair. And you can see Frankie is here for just a minute because he was being extremely bold and he ended up not only getting kicked off the craft table, but he ended up getting kicked out of the room completely. So I'm going to go in with my darkest color now and I'm going to create my shadows. And basically her hair is drawn with different strands. So I'm just putting my shading on the bottom part of each of these strands with my E59. Some of the strands are a lot smaller and skinnier than others. So for those particular ones, I'm going in with a very, very light hand, just barely touching the tip of my marker to my paper. I'm also creating a shadow where her headband is kind of hanging over some of those strands of hair, and also on the back portion of her hair where it would be in the back of her, that would also be the darkest. Anything that's furthest away is going to be darker. So I'm going to create a shadow there as well. Next, going in with the E57, going directly over the E59, but just making those lines a little bit thicker. So I'm pressing a little bit harder here, but still pressing pretty light on those smaller strands because I want to preserve a highlight area for these particular strands, or for all of them really. So depending on the size of the strand of hair, depends on how much color I'm putting down. So once I have my E57 down, I will move on to the E55, doing the same exact thing. Now you'll see in some areas I may have to go over the area more than once just to get a better blend. Sometimes when you're just blending with straight lines, that will happen, but as long as you're using a color family or blending family, a natural blending group, you won't really have too much of a problem if you go over it more than once. Again, going directly over where my E57 was and just extending those areas out. Finally, going back in with the E53 and blending everything out, but being careful not to go over the E59 too much because I don't want to move that color. The lighter the color is, the more likely you are to move around the dark color, and I wanted to try to avoid that. So next we'll move on to her clothing, and I'm going to start off with her boots, starting with the lightest color, just mapping out my very darkest areas, which will be on either side and above where the bottom part of her boot meets the ankle part, I guess. I don't know. Next, going in with the darkest color, and I'm using this very sparingly because this is such a dark color. I don't want to make my image too dark. So I'm using this very sparingly, blending that out with the C5, then the C3, then back to the C1, just preserving that highlight on the toe area of her little boots. Her boots ended up being covered up with the sentiment later on, so this didn't matter too much, but at least you guys will know how to color these. Once those were done, we're going to move on to her shirt. And I'm going to ignore the top portion of her shirt for now. I'm just going to be adding some shading again with the lightest color first to get those areas mapped out, and where her arms are laying behind her body, that would cast a shadow. And for the bottom part where her shirt is kind of flared out, the bottom part has kind of a wavy line, which would indicate that her shirt would either be gathered up or pleated or creased even. So I want to create that texture within my coloring. So going in with the darkest color, going to go right over those areas that we had mapped out for her sleeves. And I'm going to create long, skinny triangles with the darkest color on the bottom part of her shirt. And then moving on to the C5, extending those shadows out on her sleeves. And for the triangles on the bottom, I'm going to make these a little bit thicker and a little bit longer with the C5 going directly over the C7. For the top part, I'm going to create two more triangles, but I'm going right in the center, or if they were lined up, it would be right in the center of the bottom triangles. Extending everything out with the C3, including my little triangles, making each one of these top and bottom a little bit thicker and a little bit longer. And then finally going in with the C1 and filling in the rest of the area. Now for the top portion of the shirt that we kind of left uncolored here at first, I'm just going to be adding a little bit of shading to it because this isn't the main focal point. but I did add a little bit of shading off to the left-hand side and also where her hair is laying over her shirt on the right-hand side. I skipped the C7 because I didn't want it to be too dark. So my shadow color is going to be the C5. I'll extend it out with the C3 and then finally going back in with the C1 to just fill in the rest of those areas. Next, we'll move on to her skirt, her little heart pendant, and her headband. I'm going to use some RV markers, again, starting with the lightest color to map out my darkest areas. For her headband, I'm going to create some shading on either side where it's kind of tucked under her hair. I'm also doing one long flick on either side, and this will just give some added texture. For her skirt, the shading would be underneath where her shirt is hanging over her skirt and also a little bit on either side. And for the heart pendant, I'm just putting a little bit of shading off to the left-hand side just because I had to pick a side to put some shading and I didn't want to add too much color because once dark reds or dark pinks or reds bleed out to areas that you don't want it to, you're not getting them away. You're not getting them up with a colorless blender. So I wanted to be super careful that I didn't add too much color and too much pigment down onto my paper and to try to avoid that from happening. Extending all of these areas out with my darkest mid-tone, including those long little flicks that I had added to her headband there, and then finally going in with the lightest mid-tone, extending all of those areas out even further, and then going in with the lightest color again and just filling in those highlight areas. I added a little bit of a color to her cheeks with that R32. You can use any pink here, but I just had this on my desk naturally, and then added a little bit of a highlight with a white gel pen to her heart, as well as the whites of her eyes because I had colored directly over those. So I went ahead and fussy cut her out, just leaving a small white border, and then we'll move on to the assembly of the card. So I'm going to use the largest stitch rectangle die for the plaid panel and the third largest stitch rectangle die for a little wood grain or fake wood grain panel that we had created, sticking that down with some washi tape and running that through my Gemini. And now once I layered these together, they kind of blended in with each other way too much. So I ended up creating a border with some gray cardstock for each of these panels. And I don't know what gray cardstock this is. This is just from my stash. I have no idea what brand it is, so I can't link to it, but it was something that matched the fog ink pretty well. So I'm going to cut these just slightly smaller than my stitch rectangle panels. And you'll see here that I just adhered my panel down to that gray cardstock, used my paper trimmer just to cut off any excess. This was the easiest way rather than trying to measure it perfectly. And I'm gluing everything down with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue because, as you guys know, I'm terrible at lining everything up. And this gives me a minute or two to kind of readjust everything if I need to. So I liked this a lot better. This definitely brought out my different panels. I kind of laid everything down onto my white card base and tried to determine how I was going to do this sentiment. So ultimately, I decided to use another piece of that gray cardstock, and I'm using one of the sentiments that we had cut away from this little girl here, and I'm going to white heat emboss this. So I'm treating this with my anti-static tool, stamping this down with my Versamark ink, and red rubber stamps are hard to line up, especially ones that you cut apart because you can't see through them, but that's okay because we're going to die cut this as well. So I sprinkled on my white embossing powder, preheat my heat gun before bringing that to the paper, heat set that, and I'm going to use the smallest stitch rectangle die from that same Simon Says stamp die set and stick this down with some post-it note tape so it doesn't shift around when I'm putting it through my die cut machine, and ran that through my Gemini as well. Now I placed this down and realized that this probably needs a border as well to kind of make it match everything else on the card. So I'm taking a scrap piece of Nina Solar White, and this is just from my scrap bin. Cut this down with my paper trimmer just a little bit larger than my small stitch rectangle die. And I'm using one of the RV markers that I used to color some of the my image itself just to make sure everything matched. I think I used either the RV11 or RV32, but it doesn't really matter which one you use. Just going to color in all four sides to make it look as if I used pink cardstock that matched perfectly. And I went ahead and used my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere that down, or adhere my sentiment strip on that as well. So I wasn't sure how I was going to what I was going to pop up and what I wasn't. So because this is a whole lot of layers, especially for me, you guys know that I prefer one layers, maybe two. So this is a whole ton of layers for me. So I ended up adhering everything flat down with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue onto my card base, including my little girl there. But for my sentiment strip, I knew I needed to pop this up because I have so many layers going on. There's different dimensions to the card. So what I tried to start by doing was adding a little bit of Scotch foam tape to the bottom part of my sentiment because that would be laying the flattest, I guess, if that makes any sense to you guys. But it still wasn't even with the rest of the panel. So I want this to appear to be even and not one side lower than the other. So what I ended up doing is, because I pretty much only use Scotch foam tape and I don't have any foam squares or anything, I dug through my mom's stash. My mom has her crafting supplies at my house, so sorry mom, I had to use your foam squares that were a little bit thicker than my Scotch foam tape, but a little less thick than 2 layers of my Scotch foam tape. So I ended up adding 2 layers of the Scotch foam tape on the bottom portion of my sentiment strip, and then just cut down some of those foam squares to put on the top portion. And this pretty much let everything even itself out. Remove the backing of the foam tape as well as the foam squares and positioned my sentiment directly underneath my little girl here, unfortunately covering her little boots, which I think are so super cute. Next, I added a little bit of Wink of Stella to her little heart and some glossy accents. Just make sure that you give this some time to dry before handling your card too much because it will smear. It takes a little bit of time. But that is the card for today, guys. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and don't forget to stop by Instagram and enter in the giveaways. Have a great day. Bye.